Chapter 6. An Invisible Enemy. In the lecture hall of the Black Cloister, Father's afternoon was well underway. In a small study room on another floor, Hans hunched over his Latin lesson. His tutor, Jerome Weller, a shy, withdrawn young man, dozed by the window. Hans wrote the last word of his Latin lesson with a triumphant flourish of the pen. Herr Weller should be pleased this time. Hans had finished faster than usual, in spite of the noise on all 4 floors. Of course, no one expected students, guests, the older cousins, Hans's 2 sisters and 2 brothers, to say nothing of the hired help, to be silent from morning to night. After all, the Black Cloister was no longer a quiet monastery. Today, Hans became aware of another kind of noise out in the hall. Was Father's lecture already over? Students often stayed afterward for private discussions, sometimes going into an empty room and talking over the ideas Father had brought out of his lecture. This time the voices sounded different, high and strained. There was a shuffle, a grunt, a gasp, bumps, thumps, and a blood-curdling groan. Hans jumped up, pushed back his sloped study desk, and saw too late that the ink bottle had splashed over his paper. Maybe that was the devil's doing. That was the way Father always talked. Father said he'd thrown his inkwell at the devil once, but Hans was never sure whether Father meant he actually did or whether the words he wrote in ink were what he threw to scare the devil away. Hans wasn't sure what to do next. Should he copy his lesson over and avoid a scolding from Herr Weller, or should he find out what was happening? The thumps and groans continued. Hans's breath quickened. His hair prickled at the back of his neck. Was someone being murdered out there? Or was it possible that the devil was trying to lure him outside? Hans had never before thought of the devil as that real. Father's devil always seemed to bother only Father, somehow. Hans looked at his tutor. Herr Weller was still asleep with one leg tucked under him at the window seat and his head on his arm. It wouldn't hurt to take a peek outside, Hans thought, and tiptoed to the door. Instantly, Herr Weller awoke. His feet hit the floor. What is it? An unusual noise. May I see what it is? I hear no noise. It started again. Bump, slide, groan, bump, bump, groan. I can't imagine, Herr Weller began, still dazed from his nap. May I go see? Here is my lesson. Hans thrust the smudged assignment into Herr Weller's hands and slipped outside. In the dark hallway, 2 students dragged a third between them. The third student's feet dragged, making curious bumps and scraping noises. The first student leaned against the wall and panted. Casper, what are we going to do? We can't go on this way. Maybe it's not what you think, Casper said. I know the symptoms. After all, it was only 8 years ago since. Casper broke in. Let's put him in a wagon and send him home. Where'll we get one? Asked Dr. Luther. He's not through lecturing yet. Besides, we can't ask for his wagon. He needs it himself for his trips out of town. Casper eased the 6th student to a sitting position. We can't stay here. Let's find some of the hired help. Oh no, we can't do that. The news would spread all over town in no time. Casper thought a moment. Well, then, can't we hoist him up and pretend he's drunk? That wouldn't be too strange here at the Black Cloister. I understand one of Dr. Luther's nephews gets drunk pretty often. The sooner we get out of here, the better for us, and for Wittenberg too, the first student sighed. Do you really think it's the... Be quiet. Don't even mention the word. Think of what happened at the university the last time. Almost everyone fled. Casper made one last try. Can we get Frau Luther? I have heard that she is as good as a doctor of medicine herself. No, we can't. There are little ones here. They might catch it. Hans listened, at first completely baffled. Then an inkling of truth dawned. Should he let himself be seen? Should he go downstairs and tell Mother? Or should he interrupt his father in the lecture hall? No, he couldn't do that. Mother would know best what to do. Hans started down the hall. What are you doing here? The first student asked in an angry whisper. I just came out to see what was going on. Hans looked at the 6th student slumped on the floor like a pile of limp clothes. Then Hans saw the staring eyes, the mouth of an open O of pain. Who are you? Casper demanded. Hans Luthered. Both students groaned. Can you keep a secret? Casper asked. Yes, but... You mustn't tell anyone, least of all your father. What's the matter with him? Hans faltered, dreading to hear the words. At the entry of the university, a group of students talked in hushed tones. A death cart rumbled past. "Shall we tell him?" the first student asked. "No, no," Casper hissed. "Let's go." They hoisted the sick student between them and made their way to the lower floor. Hans followed. To his relief, Mother came in from the garden. "Oh, what's the matter?" Mother ran to help. "Frau Luther, one of the students has become ill and we're taking him back to his room." Always hospitable, Mother asked, "Don't you want to leave him here? We have plenty of rooms available." "No, thank you, Frau Luther," Casper replied. "It would be better if he went home." "Then go with them," Mother told Hans. "Let me know how he is." Hans followed the students down the main street of Wittenberg. At the entrance of the university, a group of students talked in hushed tones. A death cart rumbled out past the students. Hans glimpsed a covered figure behind the driver's seat. He was more certain than ever about what was happening. To his relief, he found his friends Lippus and Jost huddled near the wall watching. "What's happening?" Hans demanded. "Can't you guess?" Lippus asked. "The plague?" Hans whispered. The last siege had been in 1527, when Hans was only 2. "Yes, how dreadful. I hope we don't get it." The news spread fast over the town. People kept indoors. The outbreak was not as severe as earlier ones, but everyone lived in terror. A black cross was placed on the doors of houses where a plague victim lived. Friends advised Father to flee. He was too important to risk death from the plague. "Where would I go?" Father demanded. "The world would not fall to pieces if I died." He ministered to the sick in the firm belief that God would protect him. Only once did he become upset. He had prayed with 2 women in the home of Bartholomew Shadewalk, a town councilman. "When I came home," Hans heard Father telling friends, "I took hold of my Margaret's face with my unwashed hands. I wasn't thinking. Otherwise I wouldn't have done it, for it tempts God." He mentioned 2 university students who had died. One was the sick student Hans had seen, one day healthy and the next day buried. Father shook his head. The plague strikes cruelly and suddenly, especially the younger generation. Friends continued to advise the Luthers to leave Wittenberg. "We'll stay where we are needed," Mother said. It was strange, Hans thought. Mother was more afraid of the dreaded Turks attacking Wittenberg than of the plague, and more calm than when the maidservant from Costwig left. Father was upset about that too. A maidservant should think of her place in life and of her work as holy, he declared. He was even more upset when one of Hans's cousins came home drunk. "Drink until misfortune overtakes you," he roared. Later, he burst out, "He knows I and my family are spied on with lynx eyes from all sides. He knows that my enemies have such a sharp smell their noses reach from Rome to Wittenberg. If I had 10 virtues and only 1 fault, people would talk about my 1 fault and never mention the 10 virtues. How can I tell our preachers the words of the Apostle Paul? A bishop should be a man who takes good care of his house and does a good job of bringing up his children. How can I tell the pastors that their lives should be blameless in the face of their enemies and without offense to their friends, without even a shadow of suspicion? To think that my nephew would come in drunk." Still, Father understood the invisible enemy and knew how to combat him. "The devil hates music," Father said. "He cannot endure gaiety." In the evenings, Father played his lute and everyone sang. To persons trying hard to live as Christians, he advised, "Don't always wrestle with the devil. Don't argue with him. He has had 5,000 years of experience. He has tried out all his tricks on Adam, Abraham, and David, and he knows your weak spots. Seek company," he would say. "Eve got into trouble when she walked in the garden alone. Joke and sing. Make yourself eat. Fasting is the worst thing you can do when you are tempted." Father admitted the devil had his uses. When the devil brings bad thoughts into our heads against our will and in spite of our struggle against them, God wishes to occupy us so that we don't get lazy and snore but fight against them and pray. Father always prayed with the whole household before meals and taught the children during worship times. "Young people must be brought up to learn the scriptures," he said. When Father was away, Mother instructed the children from a small catechism Father had prepared. Mother called the little book Catechisma, and she smiled when she said the word. Hans knew it was a mixture of Greek and Latin and somehow a joke on Mother's name of Kathy. "Everything your father ever said is in this little book," Mother told Hans and the others. Father did not instruct merely by words. Sometimes he punished the children with a switch cut from a young tree. "Father hit cousin Andreas with a switch," Hans told luncheon once. "Why?" He caught him saying a bad word, Hans explained. Boys are ruined through being too easy on them, he heard Father tell a house guest. They have to be brought up stricter. If Father and Mother don't judge, later the executioner has to judge. Hans was quite aware that Father joked with Lenchen and not with him, but he did not mind. Everyone loved Lenchen. Sometimes Lenchen puzzled Hans with her talk about heaven. I know more about it than you think I do, she announced one day. How could you? I just know, that's all. Heaven is different from what anybody says. Sometimes I just know I'm going to get there early. Hans looked at her in amazement. What on earth are you talking about? Heaven. Hans remembered once when Lenchen was talking about heaven and angels to Father. My dear child, Father said, if only adults could hold fast to this faith. Her answer stayed in Hans's memory. Why, Father? Lenchen had said. Don't you believe it? It took your father years to find faith, Aunt Lena said one time. Faith? What does that mean? Hans asked. To believe God's promises are true, Aunt Lena answered. Hans thought about faith and the invisible enemy to faith. He smiled, remembering the faith his two little brothers showed in their talking. There'll be streams made of milk and white rolls will grow on every tree, little Martin told his younger brother Paul. When we're in heaven, that's what we'll eat. Lenchen explained her belief to Hans. It's like Father said once. If he offered to give you 100 gold coins which he had hidden under the table, and you said they were only lead, it would be your fault that you don't believe. Gold is gold, even if you don't think so. God doesn't lie when he promises eternal life. Our unbelief doesn't make God's promise empty. How could Lenchen know and understand so much? Hans battled with secret fears about growing up, about not being the person others expected him to be. Lenchen, on the other hand, as good as said she expected to die young and was perfectly calm about the idea. Maybe I'm like that sow Father talked about, Hans thought. He couldn't help smiling about it. A sow lies on the manure as if on the finest feather bed, Father had said, referring to people who are content not to become Christians. She rests safely, snores tenderly, and sleeps sweetly. She does not fear king nor master, death nor hell, the devil nor God's wrath. She lives completely without worry. Sometimes Father seemed to live without worry too, when Mother showed him newly hatched chickens, or brought fruit from the orchard and flowers from the garden. Are all these things from our garden? Father showed such disbelief that the black cloister gardens could produce such delights that the children laughed. Father joked about Wittenberg, which means white hill because it was built on a sand belt. Little land, you are but a heap of sand. If I dig you, the soil is light. If I reap you, the yield is slight. But, Doctor, that isn't true, Mother replied with spirit. Father teased her. Think of all the squabbles Adam and Eve must have had. Eve would say, you ate the apple, and Adam would retort, you gave it to me. But Father looked forward to the pears, grapes, and apples in the autumn as much as the children did. Oh, that we might look forward to Judgment Day in such joyful expectation, he laughed. Why couldn't people always live like that? Hans wondered. He remembered Father saying that God worked by opposites. A man would feel himself to be lost at the very moment when he was on the point of being saved. Hans tried to figure out the puzzle. Maybe for people seeking faith, the invisible enemy was really a friend. Anyway, as Father said, people should not question why God allowed certain things. Mother had said once, if it were in my hands, I would really try to get even with my enemies. Why does God spare them so? If God were to do everything with his strength, Father answered, where would that leave his wisdom and his goodness? He overlooks many things so that his wisdom and goodness may become known in our weakness. Hans was satisfied, for the time being.